This hearing will come to order. I want to welcome everybody to this budget hearing. Thanks to all for attending, and thanks to all in the audience for having an interest in what is, I think, really a truly important topic that we all must address here in Congress. I know that the Budget Committee is routinely a place where we have significant knockdown and drag-out battles and partisan activity, but my desire and goal for this activity is that it not be a partisan exercise, and I mean that sincerely. I think that what we've got to do as we look at the budgeting process is to make certain that it is agnostic as to partisanship, as to party, but to put in place a process that will actually work. There's more than enough blame to go around as to where we find ourselves, and I would suggest that if we're honest with each other through both Republican and Democratic majorities, we've had a challenge on the budgeting side. None of us are well served by a process that doesn't work. So today's hearing marks an informal kickoff to a renewed effort by this committee to reform the congressional budget process. And this is not the committee's first look at this topic, as you all know. We began to examine the broader contours of a reform effort through 2 hearings that we held last year. Nevertheless, we're beginning what will be a series of hearings over the coming weeks. The aim is to have these discussions inform the drafting of legislation to enact a true overhaul of the 1974 Congressional Budget Act. Before we get too fully immersed, though, in the details and mechanics of what a functioning budget process should look like, I think it's important that we step back and remember why we need a functioning budget process in the first place. It's important to look at the big picture to get an appreciation of the fundamentals at play in this discussion. You don't need to get much more fundamental from a legislative or a legal standpoint than the Constitution of the United States. Before there was a budget committee or the antiquated process that we have today, there was the Constitution with the roles and responsibilities and authorities that it prescribes. And the Constitution makes it quite clear that budgeting is not to be viewed as ancillary to the larger governing process, but rather fundamental to it. In Article 1, the Constitution gives Congress the power of the purse. Congress writes the laws that govern this land, and it appropriates the funds necessary to help carry out those laws. Appropriately, the Constitution does not prescribe a specific budget process for Congress to follow. The architects of our republic were wise in understanding the limits of their own foresight. They left it to Congress to fill in the blanks with a system that will allow the people's representatives to carry out their constitutional duties. Right now, we do not have such a system in place that serves the people well or that holds Congress accountable, and that may be one of the largest points that we ought to be making. Because of that fact, over time, Congress has surrendered much of its power of the purse to the executive branch. So the question we have before us today is how we can go about reclaiming Congress's authority, and in so doing, restore greater order and credibility to the governing process as a whole. Now, a breakdown in budgeting leads to a breakdown in broader policymaking. That's why this reform effort goes far beyond the interests of just this committee or our friends over at the Appropriations Committee. All of Congress and all committees have a vested interest in seeing that we have a functioning budget process. Perhaps the most troubling consequence of our current failed process is the remarkable growth in automatic or mandatory spending. This is the spending that Congress has largely avoided addressing and which is done outside the annual appropriations process. Automatic or mandatory spending is the sole source of federal spending growth as a share of the economy. Let me repeat that. Automatic mandatory spending is the sole source of federal spending growth as a share of the economy. It's the main driver of government debt. Unchecked growth in this type of spending is truly an affront to the spirit of Article 1 because it removes an important part of Congress's power of the purse, namely the power to choose when to spend and when not to spend. By design, automatic spending requires the consent of the executive, a presidential signature, to turn it off. For those needing a real-world example of what we're talking about today, we need to look no further than a recent ruling by the U.S. District Court judge. In a decision announced just a few weeks ago, D.C. Circuit Judge ruled that the administration could not expend funds to a program for which Congress had refused to appropriate money. This court ruling, in no uncertain terms, reinforces Congress's Article 1 power of the purse. Lastly, today's hearing should hopefully shed some important light on the hidden regulatory costs that are too often overlooked during budgetary discussions. In 2015 alone, federal regulatory costs were upwards of $1.9 trillion. That's private spending on complying with federal regulation. That's equivalent to roughly half of what the entire federal government spent last year. It's more than was collected in income tax revenue for the entire nation. And none of these costs were directly approved by Congress. They're born out of executive branch rulemaking, and we'll have a hearing on this topic as well in the coming weeks, which is an extremely important area to address. So we have a robust set of challenges before us, and as I mentioned, I don't believe this ought to be a partisan exercise. I think this truly ought to be able to bring parties together to reclaim the rightful authority, the Article I authority of the Constitution. A sound budget process benefits no single party or governing philosophy. It's necessary for the health of our republic, something obviously that we all care about very deeply. So I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today and for their interest in these issues. Today we have Phil Joyce, who's the Senior Associate Dean and Professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. Stan Collender joins us. He's the Executive Vice President of Qorvis MSLGROUP. And Matt Spalding, who's the Associate Vice President and Dean of Educational Programs at Hillsdale College and the Allan P. Kirby Jr. Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship. I want to thank you all for being willing to share your insights with us today and how Congress might be able to reclaim the power of the purse and restore a healthy constitutional balance of power. Our ranking member, Mr. Van Hollen, is not able to join us today, but ably sitting in his chair is the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pascrell. And Mr. Pascrell, I recognize you for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And good morning to our distinguished panel, all of whom have great backgrounds in the subject of the budget. So thanks, Mr. Chairman, for bringing us together. Mr. Van Hollen also extends his cordial welcome to all of you. I'm bemused, Mr. Chairman, though, I must say, about why we're here, making an esoteric topic. I mean, it doesn't get any more esoteric than this. Reclaiming congressional authority through the power of the purse, a top priority for the Budget Committee. And I think you mean it. I think you're sincere about this. But I'm bemused. I think that passing a budget that allows our existing budget process to work should be job one for our committee. In fact, I don't think it makes sense that we are now well past the deadline for passing a congressional budget, a resolution, and we've yet to discuss it on the House floor. Does Congress need to reclaim authority? That implies that we don't have authority now. That couldn't be further from the truth. The Congress has the ability to pass a budget and move appropriations and control the nation's fiscal policy. The budget process hasn't stopped us from developing a responsible budget. Republican majority has done that all on its own. Republicans like to talk about the failure of the budget process as if the process is divorced from the players. In fact, the process did not create the current stalemate in our political system. The stalemate is the result of a deep divide on policy and a view by some that compromise is another word for failure. There are no changes to the budget process that can by themselves change these dynamics. I admire and respect the attempt to make sure that the Congress does not lose any of its status under the Constitution. I think our forefathers meant that when they said that this is a system truly of checks and balances. But the Congress itself is caught up in process so much that we never get the substance. This year's budget process, or lack thereof, is a case in point. my brothers and sisters on the other side have failed even to bring their budget to the floor. Never mind pass it. That failure is caused by some in the party who are unwilling to abide by the most recent change to budget process law that Congress passed on a bipartisan basis just last year. Remember, we debated that on the floor of the House of Representatives. That Bipartisan Budget Act of 2015 was enacted in the wake of widespread recognition that the discretionary levels required by the last budget process reforms were not sufficient to address national and economic security needs of our nation. So Congress enacted a fully paid-for increase for both defense and non-defense spending for 2 years. I thought that was done in good faith. I thought we meant what we did, and it was not just with a wink and a blink. The budget process did not force Republicans to walk away from that deal, but for some reason there appears to be a view among some on the other side that considering or enacting additional process reforms will be a sufficient incentive to support the Republican budget. And how does that work? The majority will still be supporting a budget that does not represent our nation's values and that fails to meet the needs of the American public. The budget approved by the committee with only Republican support is a bad budget that meets the Tea Party fiscal goals of cutting programs for the most vulnerable Americans while not asking those most able to sacrifice. Not $1 of savings in the plan comes from closing tax loopholes for the purpose of deficit reduction. And that budget would cut our important non-defense investments, everything from medical research to education, to its lowest level since 1962. We ought to dwell on that just for a few moments. Because there are some here around this table, Mr. Chairman, who don't believe that the government has any responsibilities in many of the areas. I know you don't feel that way, but there are some around this table who do. Republicans on this committee claim that the spending is the cause of all of our problems, and that to be fiscally responsible, we need to cut social insurance programs like Social Security and Medicare, among other things. And most of the process ideas we've seen are focused to that end, reducing spending. Yet there seems to be nothing that acknowledges the other side of the ledger, revenues, in either their budget proposals or their process discussions. Let's take it as an example, Social Security. Social Security taxes, which stop at $118,500 in income. We've had discussions about that. That number is tied to average wages. Unfortunately, average wages have not increased very much, and thus the revenue we collect for Social Security hasn't either. The percentage of earnings covered by this tax cap has fallen since the 1980s because earnings among Americans have that cap have grown exponentially, faster than among the rest of the working population. So one could say that our current high level of income inequality is not only destabilizing our democracy, but it is a major threat to the solvency of Social Security. There are a number of wealthy Americans who don't receive income from labor at all, and their income from investments isn't subject to the Social Security tax. Since 1979, the top 10% of earners in the United States saw their incomes grow by 76%. The top 1% alone saw increases of 101%, saw increases of 174%. Meanwhile, the bottom 90% of earners saw theirs decrease by 9%. So how about taxing income from investments the same way we tax income from actual labor? How about raising the cap on income we tax to pay for Social Security? Senator Lindsay when he was a congressman, and I had proposed that in order to pay for what we do. Resolving long-term problems takes leadership to acknowledge the need to work together, and we shall. We must. We have no other choice. Compromise cannot be a dirty word. Yet, some of my colleagues started the budget year by refusing to invite a single administration witness to discuss the budget. We've never seen that before. I mean, there's some people in administration that do know some things that could be helpful to us. This deprived our committee the chance to question the approaches recommended in a whole range of policy areas. The first process reform we should be discussing is how to provide relief from the sequester-level discretionary caps that return in full force next year, and we better think about it now. We can't continue to wrest savings from important investments that can produce economic growth going forward. Over the longer term, addressing unsustainable deficits will require good faith negotiations on how to meet our nation's most pressing needs. It must include discussions on revenue, not changes in budget process. And in conclusion, I suggest to you, Mr. Chairman, that we really read Alexander Hamilton about debt, its downsides and its upsides, particularly in a time when we have low interest rates and no real inflation. And with that, I yield back, and I thank you for your attention.
I thank the gentleman, and just for the record, I continue to believe that this can indeed be a collegial activity. I know the urgent pull of politics, and I appreciate that, but I would respectfully request that we think about those things that can move all of us forward. I want to welcome again Dr. Joyce, Mr. Collender, and Dr. Spalding. Thank you for your time today. The committee has received your written statements, and they will be made a part of the formal record. You'll each have 5 minutes to deliver your formal remarks, your oral remarks, and Dr. Joyce, you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Pasquarello, members of the Budget Committee, for inviting me to share my views on the role of Congress in the budget process. I believe a strong congressional budget presence is crucial to the health of our democracy, and that ineffective congressional budgeting invariably strengthens the President and weakens the Congress. In my testimony, I'll discuss how we got to this place in addition to articulating some of the steps that might be taken in order to shift the balance of power to the place where the Congress can be on a more consistently equal footing with the executive. First, I think it's important to reiterate that the reason that the 1974 Budget Act gave us budget committees and the budget resolution and CBO is that these were viewed as essential to the Congress reclaiming the power that had shifted too much to the President. And some parts of the law have worked well. CBO has given the Congress the analytical power to challenge the executive, and reconciliation has proved a powerful tool for the Congress to cut the deficit, at least when it wants to. However, the budget resolution itself has only been passed about half the time in the last 2 decades, after having been passed every year for the first 2 decades after the 1974 Budget Act. This suggests the possibility that the problem is not procedural. In fact, in 2011, I testified before this committee with its former chair, Congressman Jim Nussle, and he suggested that, quote, before you search for new budget procedures to fix the current Hello? Yes. All right, thank you. Sit behind Papa Show, and I can actually sit behind Papa Show, waiting for him to turn around and ask me a question. Yeah, hello? Okay. All right, so I was mentioning that, that former Chairman Jim Nussle had suggested that perhaps the problem was not procedural and that we ought to actually give the current process a try. And I was suggesting that I agree, and I think the Congress had it basically right in 1974 when it created these committees and CBO and the budget resolution. These institutions and devices, when used effectively, can enable the Congress to articulate a credible alternate path for the budget. But I do want to suggest 5 changes in either law or practice that could assist the Congress in reasserting its constitutional role in budgeting. First, I would change the budget committees into committees on national priorities, which would have the responsibility for the budget resolution. These committees would include the chairs and ranking members of the appropriations and tax writing committees, and also the chairs and ranking members of other major authorizing committees. There'd be some accommodation for the balance of power in each house in that the majority party would have some more members than the minority party. The notion here is that the functions served currently by the budget committees would be taken more seriously if the committees responsible for the budget resolution were an explicit reflection of the congressional leadership and included more members of those committees who actually had to carry out the changes in law that the budget resolution envisions. Second, I would make the resolution itself stronger by thinking about how all resources devoted to particular policy aims would be used. Right now, we focus on the distinctions between discretionary spending, mandatory spending, and tax expenditures, even though all of these may have an important role to play in a particular policy area like health or housing or education. In addition, it would be useful if the budget resolution focused more explicitly on allocations to congressional committees and scrapped the attention to budget functions which do not map to anything meaningful. Third, as long as the debt is not in a stable place, I would pass a budget resolution every year. Letting the President present a plan but then having the Congress fail to respond is a form of unilateral disarmament by the Congress. Until the budget is on a sustainable path, the Congress should have to confront the future path of the budget and decide whether to use reconciliation and other tools available to it every year. Fourth, I think the rather abysmal record of the Congress on appropriations contributes to the general loss of public regard for the Congress, year after year having budget by continuing resolution and threats of government shutdowns. This puts you in a weakened position relative to the President and is a completely self-inflicted wound, in my opinion. Timely adherence to appropriations and other budget deadlines not only makes the government work better and cost less, it also strengthens the Congress as an institution. Finally, I think the Congress should take its oversight role seriously by attempting to figure out how well programs and policies are working and how they might be changed in order to be more effective. Article 1 of the Constitution comes first for a reason, and the Congress is called the first branch because of the desire of the founders that policies and laws be initiated by representatives of the people. Nowhere is the focus on Congress more appropriate than the budget process, which is the central means of deciding who's going to pay for government and what government will do. The tools are there at present for the Congress to set a path for fiscal policy and to challenge the executive branch. Power abhors a vacuum, however, and if the Congress doesn't reassert this power through law and through its own actions, it will inevitably lead to the further transfer of power to the President. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Joyce. Mr. Collender, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Price. Thank you, Chairman Price, Congressman Pascrell, and members of the committee. Many of you are not going to like what I have to say this morning. The premise of this hearing is that the White House has usurped Congress's power of the purse. This is completely false. The White House has not seized control over spending and taxing. Instead, Congress has willfully and shamefully ceded its fiscal powers by refusing to exercise them. Actually, saying that Congress has abrogated its power of the purse duties gives it way too much credit. In reality, the House and Senate have been running away almost at full speed from their legally required budget responsibilities, and they have been doing it with impunity. How else can you characterize this committee's refusal to hold a hearing earlier this year on the President's budget? And how is it possible that you didn't want to use your power of the purse to invite the Director of the Office of Management and Budget to testify so you could ask him tough questions about what the President was proposing? But Congress's willful disregard for its budget responsibilities goes much deeper. The House and Senate have refused, not been unable, but actually refused to develop a budget resolution this year. As I recently reminded a senior member of this committee's staff, the Congressional Budget Act requires you to do a budget resolution every year rather than just when the political moon, stars, and planets are in alignment. This means that Congress once again is refusing to use the precise legislative vehicle it created for itself 42 years ago, not just to maintain, but to increase its power of the purse. Congress's obvious failure on budget resolutions has at least been matched by its incompetence on authorizations and appropriations. Authorizations, which are not required by the U.S. Constitution, were developed by Congress largely to give representatives and senators who were not on the spending and tax writing committees something to do. Given the increasingly dismal record of these committees, of actually doing anything, and the lack of a constitutional requirement, it may well be time to acknowledge that the authorization of military and domestic appropriations and the authorization committees that are supposed to produce this legislation have outlived their usefulness and should be eliminated. Appropriations are an equally sad story, not of Congress being prevented from doing its job, but of its inability, refusal, and unwillingness to do what's required. One or more continuing resolutions, the technical sounding name that really means congressional inertia, has been needed every year this century. In fact, CRs are at least as prevalent today as they were in the early 1970s, when the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act was adopted in part to make them less likely. In spite of this steady stream of budget process failures, for some reason this committee is again considering a variety of changes in the congressional budget process. This makes no sense. Let me state this as directly as possible. You will accomplish nothing by changing the congressional budget process unless what you're trying to do is fool voters into thinking you're actually accomplishing something. Congress is as certain to ignore, refuse to implement, and use gimmicks to evade the new procedures you put in place as it has with all those that have come before. Indeed, this hearing is proof that the budget process changes that have been enacted for the past 40 years have failed. The failure of each of the new budget procedures, all of which were put in place with the same Pollyanna-like promises the committee is making about what it is now considering, unambiguously demonstrates that changing the process is futile. Congress will only do what it wants to do no matter what the budget law says. The truth is, Congress doesn't need a budget process at all. The U.S. Constitution gives the House and Senate all the power they need to develop, adopt, and implement a budget and pass authorizations and appropriations. The real problem is that Congress can't or won't figure out what it wants to do. This refusal by Congress to exercise its budget responsibilities means the country goes without a budget, without a fiscal policy that, except by accident, is relevant to the current and projected economy, without appropriations and without authorizations. Instead, we get government shutdowns, threatened defaults, fiscal cliffs, and totally ignored deadlines. I urge this committee to stop trying to make anyone think Congress's budget problems stem from the budget process and that changes to the process are all we need. That's nonsense. When it comes to the federal budget, Congress itself, rather than the process it uses, is the only problem. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Dr. Spalding, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Price. The budget today is at the center of American politics. It's the battleground over control of an ever-growing, increasingly centralized federal government. As Congress has delegated much of its lawmaking powers to agencies and administrators under the modern executive, it has also ceded many of its responsibilities over the government's purse strings. By doing so, Congress has allowed the rise of the modern bureaucratic state and an unprecedented fiscal situation of spending and debt that threatens the long-term economic and political health of our nation. My testimony makes 3 points: that Congress and lawmaking, and in particular the legislative power of the purse, are central to the rule of law and constitutional self-government, that the rise of the modern state and bureaucratic rule undermines popular consent and fiscal responsibility, and that Congress needs to recover its lawmaking authority and budget control for the sake of those principles. The reservation of the power of the purse to Congress was intended to constrain the other branches' ability to take unilateral action. Consequently, beyond the general legislative power with which it is alone vested, Congress's most important power is control of the government's pocketbook. It is not only a day-to-day check on the executive, but also the long-term authority by which the legislature maintains its role in national affairs. Throughout much of history, the United States government maintained a surplus budget twice as often as it allowed deficit spending without having a budget process. Congress's abdication of its budgetary powers and subsequent exclusion from important governing decisions I would trace back to the rise of the progressive movement, which sought to shift the real decisions of governing to trained administrators, supposedly separate and immune from human nature and the influence of politics. An important reform promoted by progressives to overcome the separation of powers was an executive-dominated budget system, such that presidents could represent the national will and lead a nonpartisan bureaucracy to carry it out. Nevertheless, even under the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921, most operated on the assumption that the legislature remained preeminent regarding budget matters. Some initial changes occurred during the New Deal, but the greatest centralization of the federal government and expansion of federal regulatory authority occurred in the 1960s and 70s, bringing with it what we conventionally mean by big government: huge workforces, massive expenditures, and insurmountable debt. Having created these bureaucracies, Congress was the first to adapt to the administrative state, but sought to maintain its power over the administration not through authorization and appropriation, but through post-budgetary oversight and after-the-fact regulatory relief. As Congress's ability to oversee the budget process has waned, so it has its ability to control these agencies. President Nixon sought to assert executive power over the bureaucracy, not only by controlling department personnel and regulatory process, but through impoundment. This led to the Congressional Budget Impoundment Act of '74, which restored significant legislative authority over the budget process, but did not serve to control spending and deficits. The administrative state further undermines Congress's fiscal responsibility through programs and agencies isolated from Congress's budget power, as so-called mandatory spending, or the more recent trend of self-funding to get around congressional appropriations. I suggest the budget process has failed because of a shift away from limited constitutional government towards centralization and bureaucratization. There is no consensus as to the limits of spending because there is no consensus on the limits of government action. To conclude, Congress must revive its power of the purse. There is certainly a role for litigation in this process, as a recent case suggested, but Congress can't rely on the courts. The better path is for Congress to strengthen its own constitutional muscles and use its budgetary power to make policy the executive branch is bound to carry out. Regular legislative order, but especially the day-to-day back and forth of authorizing, funding, and overseeing the operations of government will do more than anything else to restore the Article I powers of Congress. It will prevent Congress from continually getting cornered in large, messy, and unacceptable omnibus budgets, and the settlement of which works to the advantage of the executive and the administrative bureaucracy. Strategically controlling and using the budget process will turn the advantage back to Congress, forcing the executive to engage with the legislative branch. The fundamental goal of budget reform, it seems to me, is not process, but budget control. Congress must hold the power of the purse because it has been given this particular power to check the executive. Even more important, Congress has an obligation to jealously maintain control of the nation's purse because it is designated the guardian of the public treasure and so the public good. Thank you.
Thank you all for your testimony, and look forward to what I know will be a robust and vibrant period of questioning. Before I proceed with some questions, I would want to remind my my colleagues that the last time that a majority was unable to do a budget, it was when the current minority was in the majority. So as I mentioned before, this is not, I don't believe this is a partisan issue at all. It is, one that both parties have struggled with to try to figure out how to get the budgeting process moving forward. So I respectfully suggest that both parties have had a challenge, which is why I think we ought to be able to work together to find a solution. Mr. Collender, I appreciate your testimony. I don't disagree with some of it. In fact, at the beginning of you stated the premise of this hearing is that the White House has seized control over the budget and usurped Congress's power of the purse, and further, instead, Congress has willfully and shamefully ceded its fiscal powers by refusing to exercise them. I don't believe those two statements are mutually exclusive. In fact, I think that you're spot on. The executive branch, nature abhors a vacuum, and when the legislative branch, the Article I branch, the appropriate branch, is unable, for whatever reason, to proceed with an appropriate budgeting process, then it's just perfectly natural that the executive would fill the void. I would like to point out, Mr. Collender, however, that just 2 years ago, you stated in a blog post that, quote, "It's time to eliminate the president's budget." The president's budget, I'm talking about any president, not just the current one, has become a liability and no longer has much positive value as far as the fiscal policy debate is concerned. So we see again that there are varying views across the political spectrum. Dr. Spalding, I want to concentrate on a couple of specific items, and one is the issue of mandatory or direct spending. It now comprises 2/3 of the federal federal budget, moving to 3/4 within a 10-year period of time. And we struggle here with trying to figure out how to regain control of that. The simple answer is that it all ought to be on budget. But that's a hard task to accomplish. Would you please expand on how you would suggest that Congress regain control of that mandatory or direct spending?
Thank you, Chairman. In general, I think the premise here is the most important thing, which is that everything that the government does needs to be considered in the budget process. Whether something is continuing spending or quote-unquote so-called mandatory, it still has to be considered as a regular basis. It's the same thing with the spending of some of the self-funding. My point here is that Congress has an obligation, constitutionally, but also just in practical terms, in political terms, to take responsibility for those levels of spending, the long-term implications of those spending, and the fact that they're unsustainable, and forcefully consider that in a budget process. The idea that it's not under consideration and the amount of things you are to consider gets smaller and smaller and smaller as time goes by, and more activities are actually determined in expenditures by agencies and bureaucracies that are less and less under your control, just underscores the fact that I think Congress has literally lost control of the overall budgeting process of the United States.
And I appreciate that, there's a sense by some in this town, elected officials, both in the House and some in the Senate, that if folks if agencies only had mandatory spending or direct spending when they had a dedicated revenue stream that was going specifically to that spending, that would be okay. My sense is that, again, erodes the ability of Congress to determine what the revenue expenditure ought to be.
It begs the question as to why we have a constitutional structure law in the first place. That level of process is the key process to consider here. Getting down to the details, I think gets messy. We have to consider the larger thing. The reason you have a budget process in the first place is precisely so someone, here the branch closest to the American people, keeps a regular eye on that. That's why taxation has to start here. That's why Congress has that power of the purse in the first place. The idea that we should set up processes to self-fund or having streams of funding that are outside that process, That is the objective of kind of an efficiency argument that you see rising over the course of the 20th century in both political parties. That goes directly against the idea of a self-governing system of constitutional government. That's why it is here, and that's why, actually, to go to the other gentleman's point, Congress needs to figure out how to deal with this question in a nonpartisan, bipartisan way, but it needs to be done here. The legislative process, which allows for deliberation, consensus, and compromise, is precisely where it should be, as opposed to often some places where it's not seen and it's not controlled, and that debt continues to build up.
Dr. Joyce, any thoughts about both mandatory spending and also how to force, when we don't do our job, which has happened through both Republican and Democratic majorities, when that doesn't happen, what should be the forcing mechanisms from a process standpoint that require us to do our job or act?
Well, the first thing I would say is that, you know, if you go back to the reason for the 1974 Budget Act, the reason for the creation of the budget resolution, it's that before that, all of the committees in Congress were acting on a piecemeal basis, and whatever we thought the congressional budget was the more or less accidental result of all of those separate actions. The Congress was never dealing with the totals. So I think a robust budget resolution process is the appropriate way to deal with that problem. But I think what that means is that there should be a budget resolution, A, and second, that frankly, these committees should be stronger than they are. The reason that I was suggested the replacement of these committees was something like a committees on national priorities, which would include chairs and ranking members of the other significant committees in the House and Senate, is because I think it would strengthen these committees. The budget committees were made, in a sense, intentionally weaker than I think might have been appropriate by the fact that the people who set up the 1974 Budget Act included a lot of people that were on the tax writing and the appropriations committees that didn't want the budget committees to be strong.
Dr. Spalding, I want to visit the issue of continuing resolutions. I think everybody mentioned it, and it is really ceding authority to the administration, again, whether it's a Republican administration, Democratic administration, or Republican or Democratic majorities in Congress, doesn't make a difference. We all have used them, continuing resolutions. Any thoughts about forcing mechanisms to make it so that Congress, again, is not able to simply get to the end of the fiscal year and throw up our hands and say, we can't get that done, so we'll just spend what we're spending now?
Yeah, which is exactly what a continuing resolution is. It's really non-budgeting. It's a lazy response, and you're absolutely right. It automatically plays into the hands of the executive, regardless of who that executive and what political party they're in. It is Congress not doing its institutional job. The question is, can you have a mechanism by which continuing resolutions can force Congress to act? However you approach reform, it has to be towards the objective of making Congress a robust institution that thinks like an institution vis-a-vis the executive and the spending that occurs in the executive branch as it executes the law. You could ratchet down CRs so that it starts cutting budgeting as people go and creates an incentive to pass that budget. You could just put a cap on it. You could have a cap on the time on it. What those particulars are, I think others are more expert on that. But somehow, and I think Mr. Collender actually was correct, politics is politics, human nature is human nature. Congress will take the easy road if that is the easiest option. But it has to fess up to its responsibilities and take them seriously. And any reforms should force that mechanism to bring it out in the front, bring it into the deliberations of the public chamber, and force votes and force consideration of those things.
Thank you. Dr. Joyce, I want to, just got a few minutes left, a minute and a half left. I want to visit the issue of portfolio budgeting or changing how we budget, not just by functions, but by activity in the federal government. Would you expand on that for just a minute?
Sure. The idea of portfolio budgeting is that, in particular policy areas like health or education or housing, there are lots of different kinds of policies that are trying to influence outcomes in those areas. There's discretionary spending, there's mandatory spending, there are tax expenditures, and that all of those things should be considered together in terms of thinking about how can we best sort of affect health outcomes, and that largely because of the organization of the Congress, because mandatory spending is under control of some committees, discretionary others, tax expenditures others, we still tend to think about those in a piecemeal basis. So the idea is that you would try to think in particular policy areas about all of the tools and how all of them work together as opposed to thinking about them separately.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate your thoughtful responses. Mr. Pascrell, you're recognized for your questioning, sir.
Mr. Chairman, just two points I'd like to bring out before we get to the questions, if that's okay with you. And that is that we need to address, it would seem to me, and if the panelists want to talk, witnesses want to talk about this during my questioning, please do. We need to do something about the sequester level discretionary funding. I mean, this is a major part of the budget, and what's going to happen is next year it goes into full force. And we all saw what happened the first year it was in effect. So you may want to comment on that. The concept of sequester and really the tangible consequences of what we've done. Second point is, I don't know how we are approaching in terms of the budget, and it's a major part of what we talk about all the time, entitlements, on guaranteed benefits within the Social Security system and Medicare system. We're talking about pretty serious stuff here, and I think all of you understand that. We understand it on this side over. But I almost get the feeling that we approach these entitlements. And by the way, all the presidential candidates have had their own pitch to that, so I'm wondering what the heck we're doing here. They're going in one direction, we might be going in another direction. But we almost approach it like we approach the question that is facing Americans right now in terms of retirement income on pensions. They're running out. So what do? A knee-jerk reaction is to obviously cut pension benefits. I don't think that's the resolution. Mr. Joyce, let me ask you this question. Most of the process reforms, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you've discussed and other folks have discussed seem to focus on the spending side of the budget. How does the tax side enter into the budget process, and how could we increase, let's say, how could we increase the scrutiny on tax expenditures? And my second question would be, what process reforms would address taxes on the level playing field with spending reductions? Could you give us a brief response to that, if I may?
Sure. I think it's absolutely correct that we should think about tax expenditures as the equivalent of spending. That was what I really intended when I was responding to the chairman about portfolio budgeting, is that tax expenditures, because they represent money not collected, tend to be somewhat more invisible than perhaps spending programs themselves. And so I think that the Congress should think about tax expenditures as providing benefits to people in the same way that mandatory spending or discretionary spending would provide benefits to people. And I think the way to do that is through an effective budget process. I think that ought to be part of what this committee is about, is taking a serious look at tax expenditures.
Thank you. Mr. Collender, does Congress, in your opinion, at present, have the power to stop spending for programs that aren't authorized?
Of course.
Where is that power?
It's in the appropriations committees. In fact, the courts have ruled that in the absence of authorizations, the Appropriation Act is both. I should remind everybody that authorizations are not required, even mentioned in the Constitution.
So there's a basic check and balance here in terms of, who pushed Jake. We all have responsibilities here. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. And the problem is that, please forgive me, I don't mean this with as much disrespect as my tone sounds, but no one's fulfilling their responsibilities. I mean, you've got jobs to do, and it's just not getting done. If I could just respond to one of your points on the entitlements.
Yes.
It's not so much a spending problem as it is a demographics problem. That is, we, Congress, the government, set up a certain level of benefits per person based on certain qualifications, and now there are more and more people qualifying for them.
Right.
So it's not so much having to review the entitlements, it's having to decide whether those benefits are acceptable given the increasing number of people who are eligible for
So
them.
you're suggesting that perhaps we might look at a system in terms of entitlements that automatically reduces perhaps new folks coming on board?
No, not at all.
You're not suggesting it. Then what are you suggesting, Mr. Collender?
Thank you for asking. I'm suggesting that, first of all, no automatic process is going to work. All right. Second, there is a equity situation between new people coming on and existing people and people who are already on the system, especially those who were promised a level of Social Security benefits, for example, when they started working. If you wanted to do that, you'd probably have to make the change for people in their 18 or so coming into the system for the first time, and you wouldn't get savings for 40 or 50 years under those circumstances. But what I am saying is there's a basic decision Congress has to make, which is, are these benefits, are the promises that were made to provide benefits at a certain level something that you want to continue to provide, and do you have the fiscal bravery? Do you have the fiscal courage to say no? My guess is, given that it hasn't happened up till now, that the answer is no, and that you're looking for procedural changes like caps that allow you to say, look, it's not my fault. It's just under the law we have to do it. Well, you would be passing the caps law too. There is nothing automatic, procedural that's going to absolve you from these decisions.
Well, it also takes courage to compromise.
Oh, absolutely.
And that is not really the sign of weakness by any shot. But let me ask you this question. What's the cause, in your opinion, the main cause, of the current dysfunction in the budget and the appropriations process? Go to the core. Go to the center. What's the problem?
It's actually quite simple.
You're looking at the problem, or?
Basically, I don't want to cast aspersions at anyone in particular, but these are political issues that members of Congress don't want to make. I used to joke with Bob Reischauer when he was director.
Well, that's more important than the process, is what you're saying.
Oh, look, process will.
Example. Give me one example.
Well, you were just talking about it, all right? You don't like the amount that's, on Social Security, you don't like the amount that's going to be spent? All right, then stop complaining about it and start making a decision about whether or not you need to cut the benefits or raise the revenues. And by the way, Mr. Chairman, on your point about whether the program entitlement should be fully funded, that would be acceptable, I think, or at least more acceptable, if increasing revenues to match the spending were part of the options as opposed to just a spending option.
I would say, Mr. Chairman, that you hear more honesty from these three gentlemen than you hear by listening to the Appropriations Committee. That's why we invited you. Very good. You did a very, very good job, Mr. Chairman. Let me ask you this question, Mr. Hollander. So we have clear power, the Congress does, under the Constitution. And the only the Congress can authorize new spending. Oh, we're getting ourselves in jams about that, too. Mm-hmm. Only the Congress, under the Constitution, has the power to authorize spending.
Well, to appropriate.
Am I good so far?
No, they have the power Congress has the power to appropriate. I mean, the president doesn't have the power to authorize, but Congress gave itself the authority
But he just spends.
I'm sorry?
The president has the power to spend without authorization.
He has the power to spend what you've given him.
What process reforms could give Congress more power, if that's what we need, to control spending than it already has? Anybody?
Yeah. Look, on mandatory spending, with the exception of interest on the national debt, on mandatory spending, you could have to reauthorize those programs every year, essentially review them, or sunset them somehow. So that would, at least in theory, force you to reconsider those programs. On the discretionary side, it shouldn't be a question of how much are we going to spend, it's what are we trying to accomplish,
Okay.
right? Let me give you a very specific example that's very recent. TSA, all right? If the decision is that you want to keep the lines down to 15 minutes, then the question should be, how many people do we need at TSA to do that, and what's it going to cost? It shouldn't be the other way around, that is, we only want to spend this, but we want to keep the lines down at the same time.
Unless you want to go back to the era of rent-a-cop, and that didn't work, did it?
As far as I know, no.
So thank you, all three of you, and I thank you for your testimony. You've done, I think, a very excellent job, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Garrett, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So thank you to all the witnesses. I share the concern, the outrage, the frustration that Mr. Collender and the others on the panel expressed both here, and I think Mr. Collender has more vivid descriptions in some of his tweets with regard to the frustration. We all share that. What I'm hearing from some of you, and I'll start with Mr. Collender, is that part of the problem is fundamentally, as you say, in front of us, Congress, which is not just this House, it's the Senate. When we say Congress, meaning both houses, correct? Right.
Yes.
In any process, you need to have the process of negotiation. The gentleman from New Jersey said the same thing, right, to meet the middle ground. And I guess that's the problem here. Two things popped into my mind when the gentleman from New Jersey was talking. If you went back a few years back now, to the whole issue of sequester, how did we get to sequester? Remember, the predecessor to that was what? A super committee, where you would hope at that point in time you would actually get the two sides to compromise. Each one would have to fall on their swords in order to reach that proverbial middle ground and move things along, right? What happened there? Republicans threw themselves on the sword and did exactly what Mr. Pascrell asked for, and that is to talk about raising taxes, and they put that on the table. All we looked for was from the other side, if they would proverbially fall on their swords and put a proposal on the town to deal with the issue of entitlements, which is what the entire problem was about. And Mr. Chairman, was there any proposal ever put on the table from the other side? The answer, not that he recalls, no, there wasn't. I think CBO said we cannot score a proposal, speaking about what the president said, or a speech as that time. So, Mr. Collender, you see, and the other problem was, I don't know whether you spoke about this back then, but when the other side was in control in the Senate, we didn't see any budget except in 09 and 14. When the Democrats controlled this House, they were not able to get a budget even started. When Harry Reid was controlling the Senate, and even when he was in the minority in the Senate, he said, I will not move any appropriation bills unless I get what I want, which was what? Significantly increased spending. So, Mr. Collender, isn't that really the problem, that when we go to the table and we lay out proposals, there's no one on the other side of the aisle that's willing to actually even be in the room?
I'm going to answer your question directly and then give it more detail. No, that's not the problem.
So you can negotiate when there's no one on the other side
No,
of the table?
no.
Okay, well, that's what we have.
No.
That's what we've had, Mr. Collender. No one on the other side of the table to negotiate, right?
No. When in the Bull-Simpson Commission, the
I wasn't
Republican...
talking Bull Simpsons.
But I am.
Okay, well, then I'm asking on the question, on the sequester and what led to that, was there any proposal on the other side of the table, yes or no?
I don't know.
Okay, and when Harry Reid said publicly that he would not move any appropriation bills, is that the sign of negotiation?
No.
No. So that's the problem. So then it gets back to a fundamental issue. You have John Locke and the problem is how do you deal with that? When you have someone on is recalcitrant about moving forward, how do you do it? And sometimes you have to turn to law. William Penn said, if we only had good people, then we don't care what the law is. John Locke said, I don't care what sort of people you have as long as you have good law. It appears that we have to go to the Lockean approach to government now because we don't have people on the other side that we can deal with. So, Dr. Joyce, we're in the John Lockean approach. What should we be doing?
Well, actually, I wasn't going to quote John Locke, but rather Herb Stein, who was President Nixon's head of Council on Economic Advisors, who said the only way to improve budget outcomes is to have either better people or better information, and he didn't know how to get better people, so he thought the budget process ought to focus on information.
And so, and isn't that what and that's what thank you, Mr. Chairman, that's what we're here for today, is how do we get better information and better law ultimately, since we're not going to fundamentally change both houses of people. Dr. Spalding, is part of the process, where are you? You're someplace over there. It's part of the process that we have laws on the books. We have like Rule 21 on authorization and appropriations, and Congress simply doesn't say that they want to follow them.
Well, first of all, I would agree with your general comment. There is a partisan problem. I wouldn't necessarily let me broaden it for a moment. I think we have come to a point over the course of a century that we are looking at, broadly speaking, two different worldviews about how government should operate and for what purposes. And we're not directly engaging that debate. In that sense, I think a lot of this debate is overcome by partisan, by which I mean party divisions. And I think one of the biggest problems of Congress is they don't think often up as an institution. They don't think constitutionally as a constitutional branch of government. So in that sense, I agree forcefully, and that's the sense of law I would turn to. I mentioned in my testimony that
Gentleman's time has expired. Thank you. Dr. McDermott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're holding this hearing really to hide the fact that the Republicans can't pass a budget. This committee sat here and passed out a budget that people passed so that the chairman would look good. They didn't want to have the chairman fail at moving something out of this committee. We moved it over to the Rules Committee, and it sits there. And the Republicans have had conference after conference, and they cannot come to an agreement on what to bring to the floor. Now, what Dr. Spalding says is correct. When I came here to the Ways and Means Committee, the Ways and Means Committee tried to decide on a bill that would not only pass out of the committee, but would pass the floor of the House and could be dealt with in the Senate. There was always an institutional view of how things work. This country has worked for 180 years without a budget process. Until 1974, there was none. And Nixon turned the country upside down, and in came 176 new Democrats, and they said, we're going to put a budget process in here. We don't like all these old cardinals over here on the Appropriations Committee. We're going to fix that. And for 20 years that worked until Newt Gingrich got here and said, you committee chairman can pass anything you want, but it all comes to me, and I decide what goes out on the floor. And that basic style has been going on in the House since. Whether it's Democrats or Republicans, the committees have been reduced in their ability and their strength to make decisions. And what goes on in this committee makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. It makes no difference, because it's all going to be decided by the leadership and what they think they can get across the floor and then get through the Senate. And we're in another part of this building right now. They're having a hearing where they're raking over the coals a public official. He's the head of TSA, and they're saying to him, you know, you are letting those lines get too long. By God, you're not doing right by this stuff. It was the Republicans who cut the financing for TSA by taking the ticket revenue that goes to TSA and using it in other places. That kind of stuff is been going on in here. IRS, we're beating up on the IRS. We're talking about we're going to impeach the head of the IRS because of what? Nothing. And you're going to go to Zika. Right now we're stealing money from the CDC and the National Institutes of Health to deal with Ebola, because we're going to deal with the problem today on Zika. We're moving the money, and we're doing all kinds of stuff that, I mean, Metro. We run Washington, D.C. We strangle that city's ability to finance itself, and then we don't like what's happening on Metro. They're closing Metro down. They're saying we need repairs. It all comes back to our deciding whether or not we're going to deal with the issues that face this country and spend some money. You're not going to fix the opioid problem that we passed a bill out of the House yesterday or 2 days ago on the opioid problem. We got opioids all over the place, and people looking at all these people who are addicted. They pass a bill, but not one new dime in it. Not one new dime. So Where's the treatment going to come from? The magic of that thinking is really pretty amazing when you think about it. That you can pass a bill, put no money in it, and figure that it's going to fix the problem. And that's what's going on here. It reminds me of that old cartoon. If I could have found it, I would have put it up on the screens. Walt Kelly's many years ago, where Pogo stands up in the middle of the swamp and says, "We have found the enemy, and he is us." The fact is that this place, as has been said, has stopped functioning as an institution dealing with the problems of the United States. It has become so partisan in who controls it and how we get rid of any kind of entitlements in this country. We would go back to 1932 or 1928 instantly if the Republicans had their way, but they can't do it because the people will not give up Social Security. Social Security could be fixed in a minute by lifting the cap, very simply. And the same is true of Medicare. There are a whole lot of ways in which it could be fixed if we would act.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Palmer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Spalding, thank you for being here. I was reading through some of your testimony, which I find your writing fascinating and very insightful. And you make the point that no money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law, and a regular statement of account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. When you talk about all public money, is that all federal revenue or just what we take from our citizens through the taxation process?
I think they primarily meant it from taxation, but beyond that, it includes other revenue that you bring in from other forms.
Thank you. You also point out that Congress is the guardian of the treasurer, and you make the point that the reservation of powers to Congress over the power of the purse is important in regard to constraining other branches, such as the federal agencies. Do you consider the restraining of federal agencies through the power of the purse essential to maintaining representative government?
Oh, absolutely. The burden of my testimony, or one of the main things I tried to point out, is the careful interweaving of the expansion of agencies and regulatory rule with the problems of the budget. It's no coincidence these things are roughly parallel. You can add mandatory spending on top of that, but the delegation of power away from Congress with the abdication, in many ways, of the budgeting that gets us to the problem, I think, is the heart of the problem. And that's what I meant earlier by saying that this is partisan, not in the Republican-Democratic sense, but partisan in the sense that it's two different diametrically opposed philosophies of how we should govern and how that framework of governing ought to operate.
So, when we're taking into consideration what we're appropriating, it's not just the tax dollars. It would be fines, fees, and other revenues, and that you make the point that American presidents under the Constitution, and arguably we should be operating under the Constitution. You would agree with that, wouldn't you?
Absolutely.
Would you agree with that, Mr. Collins?
Yes, absolutely.
How about you, Dr. Joyce? You make the point that American presidents cannot withdraw a dime without appropriation from Congress. Considering the amounts of money going directly into agency accounts, and by the report we have here from the Office of Management Budget, it's $516 billion, and I'd just like to point out, Mr. Chairman, that's almost half what the budget that this committee approved, and I don't think that counts fines, or other sources of revenue. It just seems amazing to me that in the consequence of what we're trying to do in the budget and controlling the appropriations process, that we wouldn't count that as part of our revenue, part of the public money, and that we wouldn't have Congress responsible for appropriating that money. What are your thoughts on that?
We misunderstand the power of the purse if we think of it in a narrow budget process sense. It's a constitutional obligation to keep control of the pocketbook of the nation. Keep it away from the less unelected, and also those that are not immediately responsible through election. That includes the executive in general, but especially all the things underneath the executive. The idea that they can appropriate their own funds through self-funding or merely have mandatory streams of money that you do not control, you can't stop, you can't change, you can't amend at will. Congress is the legislative branch and has the lawmaking power. Power of purchase is a subset of that. You have the sovereign power of government in the ability to make laws.
I've only got a minute here. I just want to point out with the Consumer Financial Protection Board and 18F, that technology group that the president established, they get no funding from Congress.
That's correct. And you
So,
can't
in effect-
re-amend that funding. You can't affect that funding. That is a blatant violation of the Constitution.
So
as
in
far as I'm
effect, we've
concerned.
unconstitutionally created a fourth branch of government that's unelected and unknown to the vast majority of Americans.
And exists outside of the rule of law and the Constitution.
Let me make one other point here. You also brought up House versus Burwell, and I think that's a very consequential decision by the Supreme Court in the context that the court ruled that the administration violated the Constitution by funding the Affordable Care Act's cost-sharing program without appropriation from Congress. Would that, in your mind, open the door for Congress to file other challenges where the administration is appropriating money, whether it's tax money or fees, fines, whatever, from the Treasury?
I think it absolutely does. I'm not opposed to Congress using litigation. My only point was that litigation shouldn't be the default option. It's more important to do budgeting well in the first place.
Thank you for your.
Yes,
thank
use
you.
litigation.
I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Moore, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Ms. Moore.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to join my colleagues in welcoming our distinguished panel here today. I have noticed that you all, to some extent, seem to be singing out of the same hymn book. And I think that's rare when you have majority and minority witnesses. So I guess I just want to congratulate you all on really hitting some core points. I just want to go over a few things with you all. All of you have talked about, I mean, the presumption being that we need to wrest control from the executive branch, that mandatory spending, as I believe Dr. Spalding is focused on a lot, is an example of our just putting spending on automatic control and not really legislating. Regulatory control, stuff like the 18F program, I don't even know what that is, but I learned about it from you, Dr. Spalding, being a program where hundreds of employees are employed and we don't have any control over that. Program revenue sources. So I guess the question I'm going to start with is with other assertions that you all have made with regard to keeping the budget process as it is, trying it out, and letting it work, and how does that square with some of the problems that we have seen? For example, with mandatory spending, I was digging through my papers, I can't figure out which one. Raise your hand if you were the one who said it, that this is an example, I guess, of congressional cowardice, to not just say, hey, we got a problem here, we've got the demographic shifts, so we're going to sort of put some sort of process in place so we can blame it on the process, as opposed to us standing up saying, we made a decision to raise the caps or cut the benefits or to, who said that?
I did. It wasn't in the written testimony, though.
Right, right. And so, I mean, I thought that was very compelling. I mean, are we here trying to find a, is mandatory spending, is that an example you all think of a broken budget process?
If I could say, I think it's an example of congressional inaction. I wouldn't say it's an example of a broken budget process, because I think you actually have the tools available to you to affect mandatory spending. When I worked at CBO starting in 1991, the thing that people seemed most concerned about was the pending demographic shift when all the baby boomers retire. And the notion was, if we start thinking about this now, we won't have to take such drastic action when it happens.
Okay,
Well, it's
okay,
happening.
Dr. Joyce, I appreciate that. So how does that square with kind of your notion of an outcomes-based budgeting? So if, for example, we decided that the biggest problem that we have is mandatory spending, how does that square with our desire to have an outcome that would take care of our seniors and not just simply say, well, you know, we got to pay for wars and stuff, so therefore we're just going to look at this as a number. How does that square with that notion?
Well, the idea, of course, it is the job of the Congress to think about the relative, Congress and the President, to think about the relative priorities of the nation and which things are more important.
So we might just say, hey, we got to raise taxes because it's our priority to take care of seniors and do Medicare and Medicaid. Let me ask Dr. Spalding a question before my time expires. One of the things, I mean, when I first got here, I've been here 10 years. When I first got here, we had earmarks. And of course, I wasn't one of the big muckety mucks who could get billions or millions of dollars. But earmarks were very important because as a representative, only I knew that we need to dredge a river or to fix a bridge and to prioritize that. You know, our seating control, and of course, our current president, President Obama, he's against earmarks. Well, duh, he's the president. Do you think that we have ceded control over the budget process to the executive branch by saying we're not going to allow any earmarks? Of course, we would want transparency, but is that an example?
The question of earmarks is an interesting one. I look at this from the point of view of the separation of powers, the relationship between the executive and the Congress. I favor Congress keeping as much control of as much things as possible. So even though I think earmarks is a source of potential corruption and use and deals, the fact of the matter is when Congress doesn't do it, it essentially cedes the control of that earmarks over to unelected individuals and administrative agencies. Yeah. And they do either their own will or they follow the will of the executive, but who increasingly can't control them either. Jim. So I don't favor them in general, but I mean, I think Congress needs to take control. They've lost control of that government, and the budget process is the key way to do that because budgeting is the way you govern.
Gentlelady.
Thank you. Thank you for your...
Thank you. You bet. Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Renacci is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for holding this hearing. I mean, I think it's important we look at the process. I want to thank the gentlemen here as witnesses, too. I think your comments, as I've heard several times, you're agreeing and disagreeing, but in general, I think you're coming up with the same idea. The thought process is that we have a process that's broken. Mr. Collender, you mentioned the budget process. When you said that I don't even think we need a budget process, well, I would disagree 100% with that. That's the starting point of everything. I mean, in the business world, which I was in for 30 years, you had to start with the budget. You had to start with the process. I was also the mayor of my community. You had to start with the budget. You had to follow the budget. The biggest problem we have here is that we have budgets that we don't follow, and we have processes that we don't follow. So I disagree that we shouldn't have a budget. I think the budget should become stronger. I think we have to come up with a way to make sure that it's followed. I bet that most people don't realize that even during that era where we say we had a balanced budget back in the 90s, that we spent more than we budgeted. Most people don't realize that. And the only reason we had a surplus during those years is we had something called the dot-com bubble, which just produced a tremendous amount of revenues that nobody expected. We're not going to have that dot-com bubble in the future, so we really have to look at our process and make it work. Too often our budget processes aren't completed. I agree with all of you on that. What's even worse is when they are completed, they're not even followed. So we pass budgets and then we break them. I bet you most members don't even know that they're breaking the budget with half the legislation we pass. And that gets back to Dr. Joyce, your comment, which I'm not sure we can do, but you said budget process reform should not only ensure that we develop a budget resolution, but that it also be enforced. So I know you're agreeing with me there. But you said about restructuring the composition of the Budget Committee to include those members. That's a little bit difficult, but wouldn't it be better to restructure the budget process so that the membership, that the budget has enough bite that the rest of the committee chairs have to follow it?
Well, my only question would be how. We don't have a very good history of creating sort of swords of Damocles that can fall on the Congress that prevent them from doing things that they otherwise want to do, going all the way back to 1985 with Graham-Rudman-Hollings, but also, you know, looking forward to the sequestration. The sequestration was something that was never supposed to happen. It was supposed to make the Congress do budgeting the right way. So I think that, you know, if we could come up with what those enforcement mechanisms might be, then I think you're right. But my notion is that part of the reason for this is because the budget committees and the budget resolution itself are not as strong as they should be.
And that gets back to the comment that somehow we have to make it stronger. We have to make it the guide, the blueprint, whatever we follow. As I said, going back as a mayor, if we didn't balance a budget, we were in trouble. And we had to balance the budget. And many times, if you didn't balance a budget and you continue to have deficits, you were thrown out of office, which is one thing that doesn't seem to happen here enough. When we continue to have budgets and deficits, we need to fix, because it's only the future generations that are going to have to pay for all this. Dr. Spalding, I agree with your statement that regular legislative order, but especially the day-to-day back and forth authorizing funding and overseeing the operations of the government will do more than anything to restore the Article I powers of Congress to get control of an unlimited government. Near the end of your testimony, you state the fundamental goal of budget reform should be budget control. Outside of adhering to regular order, what do you think is the #1 thing Congress can do to not only ensure we pass a budget, but the policies are actually implemented?
Well, I think the challenge here is how do you enforce it? The conversation you just had, I agree with the essential elements of that. What I actually argue for is more politics, which is to say that we need to bring these deliberations back into the legislative body, out onto the floors, into the committees, and actively and aggressively debate them and argue about them. Congress has lost its constitutional muscles and has failed to realize that actually it is that day-to-day regular order in which committees get multiple bites of the apple. They debate it. You can send up smaller appropriations bills. Why does there have to be 12? You guys have the power to do all these things. You just need to think strategically and politically, in the larger sense of politics, not the narrow sense, about how you're acting as an institution to get to that budget so that you can then give it to the president. And that's how the separation of powers is supposed to work, and I think we just don't do that. And so as a result, the willpower, which is weak, will always take the easy way out, which is why you don't enforce them now. You need a process as a framework, and it needs to be strong, but then it's to allow politics to occur. Compromise, deliberation, argument, debate.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady from California, Ms. Lee, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. Very good, interesting, and informative discussion. Want to ask, well, 2 questions. First of all, just a general question in terms of how you viewed a budget. Some of us say it's a moral document, it's a statement of our values as a country or as a family, and we prioritize our resources based on those values. How do you view a budget, our national budget, from your perspective? I just want all 3 of you to answer that question for me.
I think a budget is a reflection of the nation's priorities expressed in dollar terms. That simple.
And I would say that the budget we have now is more a reflection of past priorities and current priorities. That is, given Congress's inability to put together budgets and maintain them, what we've got is more inertia than actual decision-making, and appropriations bills where incremental increases are figured as common. There is no discussion about whether, and this is a hypothetical, so please don't anyone take this personally, whether we still need a Department of Agriculture, for example. Do we? And if so, what do we want it to do? And what, those would be the kinds of questions that a budget should answer. But it doesn't anymore. It's basically what we did last year, or maybe even the year or the year before that.
I would agree with both those comments. I think the budget is a national priority. I believe it is our moral commitments to the American people. But also I think it represents your commitment to overseeing the operations of this thing we call the government, which is, like it or not like it, whether we think it's too big, it does a lot of things, and you have the responsibility to oversee those. So part of it is it's 2 sides of that commitment. It represents the priorities that are set through elections for the American people, but also Congress's institutional obligations to monitor that those programs, as you said, and look at them regularly to make sure they're fulfilling those obligations and are sustainable.
So if we monitor programs that, for instance, SNAP, that would create billions of dollars in cuts and people go hungry, is that our priority or is that a value judgment in our budget? Is that okay to do from your perspective?
The outcome, in my personal perspective, would be no. The question is, what does the Congress in its infinite wisdom decide? Do they want to feed these people? Is it part of our moral authority or requirement or not? And if the answer is yes, we want to do it, then we should be willing to pay for it, not say we want to do it but not provide the money for it.
I would just add that I think the important thing there is for the Congress up front, when it's deciding to fund something like SNAP, say, what do we expect SNAP to do? What are the outcomes that we're looking for? And then it's the responsibility of the Congress to exercise oversight over that program in order to determine whether it's actually achieving those outcomes or not.
I guess I would add to that, Congress also has an obligation to make sure what it's doing fits within the boundaries of its constitutional powers. Those can be read pretty broadly, necessary and proper clause, but that is a consideration that has to be thought through as part of that budgetary obligation. Congress can't do anything and everything at once. It's too wrapped up into very, very small details nowadays that are better done probably at the local level of government. And to the extent that you get wrapped up in those things, I think that's one of the problems with the budget process. It is so detailed that you have to then give it over to bureaucratic agencies, which you can only control after the fact. And you lose a sense of what they're actually up to, and so you can't set priorities anymore.
So if people go hungry, if it's not a constitutional requirement, but Congress decides that, it's okay?
I think that Congress has an obligation to think through what is the best way to provide for the well-being of the American people. And I think it's a legitimate question whether some of those programs are best done through federal bureaucracies or at the state level, at the local level. And Congress should figure out the best way through economic incentives and opportunity to make those work well. We don't have that as part of our debate anymore. One of the problems with where this budget process has gone is we largely assume that every detail of American life should be something that comes before Congress. We write extremely vast and complicated laws that are hard to read, and agencies differ on how to interpret them. And then you push it off to agencies which themselves are not responsible to elected officials. There you have your problem.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask one more question very quickly?
You've got 12 seconds.
Or I'll wait until, okay, OCO, the OCO account, there's an article, Pentagon Slush Fund Endangers National Security. I don't know if you've seen it yet, by Paul Schenkman. And you know what takes place with OCO. We're funding Iraq and Afghanistan. The war is off budget without the normal, aside from the normal defense allocation process. Do you think that that's the correct way of funding these wars?
Gentleman's time has expired. I would ask that you reply in written form for
Okay.
the questions for the record.
Okay.
Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our panel for joining us today. I spent 26 and a half years in the Air Force, and I can tell you, being on the other side of the fence, on the receiving side of the budget process and the uncertainty that creates in terms of mission effectiveness for national security, we've got to figure out how to fix this. I look at the statistics that I saw this morning, the status quo. Over the last 25 years, only 16 times have we had a budget conference agreement. Appropriations completed on time, only 48 out of 314. My goodness. That's not a very good track record for the people that are supposed to be in charge of the budgeting process. Making good judgments in budgetary decisions, of course, depends on having good information about the characteristics and the cost of programs, and that requires oversight. So, Dr. Joyce, is Congress doing enough oversight of spending programs, and what incentives could be built into the budget process to encourage more rigorous oversight?
I think Congress is doing a lot of oversight. I'm not sure it's doing the right kind of oversight. The kind of oversight I think that's most effective is where you look at programs and policies and you ask how well they're working, not where you haul some administration official in front of a committee to sort of, slap them on the wrist because of some particular transgression. I think that kind of oversight is hard to do. There aren't a lot of incentives for doing it, frankly.
Let me ask you this, because that begs another question. I know that in business, when you begin executing a new program, you build key performance indicators and metrics into the programs before they're ever approved. Most boards require that in order to allocate the funding. Wouldn't it make sense before Congress approves particular programs that there be some kind of identification to or measuring criteria to determine whether those programs are effective or not?
Absolutely. Going all the way back to the passage of the Government Performance and Results Act in 1993, that has been a renewed effort both in law and successive administrations, but I think the Congress hasn't paid nearly enough attention to the performance side of the equation.
Dr. Spalding, do you have an opinion on this?
Well, my general observation from a constitutional point of view is oversight is after-the-fact budgeting. It's important, it's necessary, but it should be seen as part of the budgeting process, which is say it should be seen as a secondary element to the budgeting process. You should budget better up front. That gives you more leverage when you do oversight. And if you have better budgeting, you go into oversight hearings with some leverage against who you are overseeing. Namely, Congress might well cut that budget. It used to be back in the 80s and the 70s, right? People feared coming to testify before Congress because they might have their budget cut or they might have that position eliminated. Better budgeting is the solution, I think.
Is it safe to say then, Dr. Spalding, that yes, we need to do oversight, and I agree with you, Dr. Joyce. We don't always do the right kind of oversight. So what we're really saying is that more planning up front when we put programs in place so that we have a measurement of whether or not they're going to be effective or not. That way we've got something to oversee and something to go back to and compare to. Is that, am I understanding you right?
I completely agree. That kind of oversighting planned out and put together in as a strategic whole is the key to making it help you solve your problems.
Sure. What are there any tools available to assist now? I mean, do you have any specific recommendations, Dr. Joyce, on how we might go about doing some of this now?
Well, I think the executive branch over the last, really going back to both the Bush administration and the Obama administration, has been actually spending a lot of time and attention developing performance metrics. I'm not sure how much attention a lot of congressional committees have paid to the information that's already out there. So the first thing I would do is avail yourself of the information that's out there, and if you think that there are other kind of metrics you want besides the ones they're collecting, then by all means ask for them, but I don't think a lot of attention has been paid so far.
Good point. Dr. Spalding?
I just make a general point. The more you get down into, with all due respect, metrics that are so far down in the weeds, it might help you on the details of it, but you also need to conduct oversight hearings in a bigger picture that people can understand, and you can make arguments in the political sector by hauling people in to make the points about your budget authority over those programs.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Great. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay, I came out of the Wisconsin legislature and was involved in many budgets over a period of time, and like I think a lot of the state legislators, you get here and wonder why things work so poorly in Washington. And there's some things that immediately pop into my head, so I'm going to ask you what you think about them. In the state of Wisconsin, as I assume with most other states, if we don't pass a budget on time, it is not as much of a crisis in that we automatically have what here would be referred to as a continuing resolution. Automatically continue on spending levels of the prior year. So you don't have this perception that there's this huge disruption. I think given that we're broke, maybe it wouldn't be a bad idea to do a continuing resolution minus, say, 1%, because really, given the mess we have, we really ought to cut spending everywhere, or almost everywhere. But I'd like to ask each one of your opinions on the idea of putting into law a permanent continuing resolution so that if we don't get something done by October 1st, it's not like everything shuts down, I mean, ultimately Congress would, put every individual item up or down a little, but at least continuing along both at current levels and current levels minus 1%. Dr. Joyce, we'll take you and run across the table here.
So I want to preface this by saying that even among those of us budget wonks, there are disagreements about automatic continuing resolutions. Some people are quite supportive of them. I am not. And the reason I'm not is because I don't think we need to make it easier to pass continuing resolutions. I think we need to make it more difficult. I think there's enough damage that's caused by government by continuing resolution that I would go the opposite approach, which is to prohibit continuing resolutions or make them more difficult to pass, because I think continual government by continuing resolution is actually worse than a government shutdown every once in a while, and the threat of a shutdown might actually be what makes the budget get passed on time.
Dr. Joyce, I'm going to jump in here. Has it occurred to you that maybe some people may feel it is their political advantage to have a shutdown? Did that cross your mind?
I suppose it's crossed my mind that some people might think that, but I also think that the continual government by continuing resolution creates a lot of sort of relatively invisible but very much real damage in terms of both the credibility of the Congress, but also the uncertainty it creates for federal agencies and their effectiveness.
Okay, Mr. Callender?
First of all, thank you. Yes, I have assumed for a while that shutdowns would be the equivalent of political campaign events for many members of Congress. That is, going home that weekend and saying, look what I did, or look what I prevented, and look what's happened in the government shutdown, and aren't we terrific, or aren't I terrific, is actually a positive political position for many members of Congress. So yes, I have thought that for many people it's a positive rather than negative. I wonder whether you would be as in favor of automatic continuing resolution if instead of it was this year minus 1%, it was this year plus inflation, so that spending would go up automatically. I mean, the point I want to make here is that you're subtly putting in place a policy preference of reduced spending.
Oh, we just say keep it even. Why don't we just say keep it even?
Well, for some people that would be reduced relative to inflation, and buying power. But the point that Dr. Joyce was making is I couldn't agree with more. We should be making it harder, not easier, to pass continuing resolutions or to put them in place, and then let the voters decide if they're angry because there's a shutdown.
Okay, Dr. Spalding?
Thanks for the question. This is a preliminary thought. I have to think this through more from an institutional point of view. I think that in general, I agree we should make it harder for continuing resolutions, but I think you have an obligation, in my opinion, to not naturally go into government shutdowns. So the way you can do it, it seems to me, is to have it have a threat to it. And if that's a cut of some significance or something else like that that forces people to the table, that seems to me could be very useful. It needs to be done in a context of other aspects of trying to improve the budget process, it seems to me, because otherwise it will become an easy default.
So straight up and down, if you were in Congress and they said, we're going to pass a bill saying that there's always an automatic continuing resolution until the budget passes, so we don't have these, threats to shut down national parks or something, would you vote yes or no?
I would prefer to break it into several pieces and put some things that are less objectionable in other parts.
That's a good politician answer, but I'm the politician. Good politician answer. Okay, I'll yield the rest of my time.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Luan Grisham, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate the opportunity to have a dialogue about the importance of a budget, the opportunity always, whether or not we're in a situation where we've got real disagreements in this country and in this Congress about what the next priorities ought to be and steps for having both appropriations and a budgetary process that has some stability in it. And I think absolutely, given the fact that we've got a complicated system and trillions of dollars that we're appropriating, that the budget process could always be improved. But it seems to me that this dialogue has gone kind of right back to all or nothing design, and all or nothing design every single time, I think, is poor for this country. And to say, have voters figure it out, that's what we're here for, and I get the opposite in my state. So national security, I think there isn't anybody on this committee who would say that national security isn't important. We may disagree about how we deal with it and what, when, and where. But I'm in a defense industry state with 2 of the national labs. Every time we have uncertainty in the budget process, national security is impacted. Every single time we do a CR, no predictability, not sure exactly what that means, current budget strategies, which in my state are really poor still. That means that they aren't spending money in the right ways, or that they're proactive about national security. So in my state, my constituents are saying, well, if you believe national security is important, and that's why I'm on this committee, then how is it that we can't figure out a system and a process that allows you to give us that certainty and predictability? Because what I expect from them is to give us, all of us, advice from the labs and those defense contractors about what we do that improves those opportunities in 2 ways. To be proactive and thoughtful so that we're safe and secure, and to engage in technologies and research that have us spend less money in a defense context, right? Because we're smarter about those dollars, which I will tell you everyone in my state, both parties, also expect. And so I think that our job is to be doing process work all the time. But that should not eliminate the requirement to pass a budget and do the appropriations process, which is, for me, and I don't even try to profess. I'm a lawyer. I practiced law for 10 minutes. My constitutional expertise would be called in question by every lawyer in the country. But that's clearly what our job is here. And so I'm a little concerned that the debate, or even not that we're not debating, but the conversation goes right back to government shutdowns, CRs, always the opportunity for CRs, because it minimizes, really, I think it gives you the wrong incentives. And even though it might feel like, you know what, if your labs were on the cutting block, you'll work really hard. I work really hard every day anyway. And while, I disagree with, well, particularly Mr. Bloom there, right there, he's on my hallway. But I know that he works hard every day to make sure the things that he thinks are important get done. So I'm disappointed that that's how the dialogue ends up, because we can be doing all of it in those ways that make sense. I just want to tell you that I think people care in a way that Mr. Collender, these are all rhetorical questions, and you wouldn't have to have me tell you that to know that unequivocally. But we have the power to pass appropriations bills without ideological riders. We already have that power. Congress has the power to fund government without continuing resolutions, which for me are job-killing issues, unequivocally. No debate about that. If you are in my state, worst economy in the country, highest unemployment rates, we're the only state in the nation with migration out of the state, all job-related. And yet we have the highest PhDs per capita in the country because of the labs. All right, so continuing resolutions stop the economy, hurt jobs, and don't make this country any safer. We already have the power to fix sequestration, but we aren't doing it, and enact a balanced deficit reduction environment. We aren't doing it. So as much as I really appreciate, and I do, it sounds like I'm lecturing you, and I don't mean that at all. We ought to have these conversations, but these conversations should not continue to push us in a place where we're an all-or-nothing design, and we aren't getting a budget passed, and we aren't doing appropriations bills that really get at the heart of the priorities for each of our districts and states and the country. And Mr. Chairman, after my lofty speech, I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentlelady. Gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Black, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I regret that I wasn't able to be here for the first part of this hearing, because this is a very important conversation. We were honoring our military women this morning out at the memorial, so I apologize for coming in a little late. I want to continue along the vein of my colleague from Ohio that talked about restructuring the budget process and also making the process stronger. So one of the proposals that is being advanced is to transform the budget resolution from a concurrent resolution agreed to by only the House and the Senate to a joint resolution that would be signed into law. And the idea is to get the buy-in in both Congress and the President up front before Congress moves into the individual appropriation bills. Would that make Congress's role in the process more or less substantial? Mr. Joyce, your thoughts on that?
Again, I'll preface this by saying that people who I respect a lot are big supporters of a joint budget resolution, and I am not. And the reason that I am not is because I think the last thing we need is something that makes a budget resolution even more difficult to pass than it is now. And it's hard to get the House and Senate to agree without bringing the president into it. I agree that it would be a good goal to have everyone be in agreement up front, the House, the Senate, and the president. I'm very skeptical about that actually occurring unless you had the House, Senate, and the president all under the control of the same party, in which case it probably wouldn't be necessary to have that sort of forcing device.
How about you?
Congressman, thank you. First of all, agreeing with Dr. Joyce, but it would make matters worse in terms of restoring Congress's power of the purse. The purpose, supposedly, the purpose of this hearing. Remember, the budget resolution was designed back in the 70s to provide Congress with a blueprint to use passing revenue and spending bills. What you're likely to do under those circumstances is make it impossible to ever see a budget resolution again. And Congress with no guidelines, with no, would end up probably with more continuing resolutions rather than less. Or the process would take much, much longer, be much more last minute. I would much prefer that you do what you're supposed to do now, which is just pass a concurrent resolution and then deal with the president on the individual appropriations and authorization bills.
Dr. Spalding, would you like to weigh in on that?
I would agree with that assessment. I think your strength in the direction you should be going is strengthening your appropriations bills, and trying to do it up front would probably just encourage and increase the odds of just having continuing resolutions, from what I can tell.
I know I don't have very much time left, but one of the things since coming here to Congress that really has bothered me is when we do a budget, we're only doing it on discretionary spending. We're not doing it on mandatory. Mandatory is the greatest factor in our debt. And so looking at that, and I don't have very much time left, and I would like to hear from each one of you about, what do you think about some way of being able to do our annual appropriations with including some of these entitlement programs? Dr. Joyce?
I mean, I guess I would just, reiterate that the reason for the creation of the budget committees was to try to have somebody who was looking at all spending and revenue at the same time. So I think having a stronger, more effective budget committee and budget resolution process is the way to do that, unless you want to go in the direction of creating caps on entitlement spending or something like that, which is a relatively drastic step.
The budget resolution, actually, to disagree with you just slightly, respectfully. The budget resolution is supposed to look at everything, all spending. It doesn't just look at the at appropriations. So when you say we have a budget that just deals with discretionary spending, that's not quite correct. If you actually had a budget resolution, had a debate on the budget resolution, had a discussion during the debate on entitlement spending, you would achieve what you're looking to do. You would also have the authority through reconciliation to make changes in entitlement spending, should you wish to do that. But if you're not willing to to do what's necessary to get a budget resolution, you lose the ability to do anything on entitlements.
A point well taken on the budget resolution, and that we do have at least some direction in there, but when you actually come down to the dollars that are being spent, we don't really do a lot on the mandatory side. It's the appropriation process does on the discretionary side. Mr. Spalding? Or Dr. Spalding?
No, I think from a broader perspective of what your obligations are, you need to have everything under consideration. Everything has to be in your budget. To understand how it works now, I think I would agree that it does come before you in the budget resolution, and there's no reason why you can't engage on those questions as you so choose. But from a power of the purse point of view, you have an obligation to look at everything.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Blum, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Price. Thank you to our panelists for being here today. And I likewise apologize for being late in the midst of many committee hearings. I'd also like to acknowledge Ms. Grisham's compliment of me. It's kind of amazing what buying a little chocolate will do around Washington, D.C. I've got 3 simple, easy questions, probably the easiest of the day. First of all, I'm from the private sector. I'm a career businessman. I never understood what off budget meant until I got to Washington, D.C. And the first, last year when we did the budget, there's something called OCO, Overseas Contingency Operations, which is off budget. I like, you know, we're here talking about how do we get authority back and how do we control budget. And first of all, call me simple, but everything should be in the budget. I'd like to have your thoughts quickly, if we could, on off-budget items and how we get them on budget.
Well, I think quickly, I think everything should be in the budget. I think OCO is an example of something where it's considered separate from the regular defense budget. It would be my preference to have all defense appropriations considered together. So in that sense, it's not that off-budget means it doesn't count against federal spending. It means it's not considered in the same way that the regular appropriation bill is considered, and I think everything ought to be together.
Yes, everything should be on budget. There was some movement towards that a few years ago, but it's an example of what I said in my testimony, which is Congress always finds a way to evade the rules. And even going back to Dave Stockman, they took the purchase of strategic petroleum reserves, oil, off budget, so it didn't count because they couldn't make the deficit. That was the best way to make the deficit look smaller.
Dr. Spalding?
I think everything needs to be on the budget, and there might be reasons for having various operations for national security purposes done separately. I recognize that. It's a perfectly prudent thing. But the idea that they can become larger, essentially slush funds to support operations outside of your control, I think is extremely problematic from a broader point of view.
Thank you. CFPB, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Now we're not even talking about off-budget. It's not anywhere on our radar. Funded, as I understand, outside of Congress by the Federal Reserve. How is that constitutional? A, and B, how can we get that authority back under Congress for the CFPB, the funding? Dr. Joyce?
I haven't done enough study into that, and I'm not a constitutional expert, so I will defer to my colleagues who may know more and not take your time.
What do you think of the concept of an agency of the federal government that we have no authority over its spending?
Well, I think it would be best if there are pieces of the federal government and they are spending money for the Congress at some point to have authorized that spending, whether, through whatever process.
Thank you.
And the only thing I'm going to say is, if you'd like to get it back, pass the legislation to change the underlying authorization. Congress has the ability to do it, it's just not doing it.
It takes a little willpower, correct?
It takes some political courage.
Mm-hmm.
I think the problem goes beyond, in this case, it goes beyond the power of the purse. I mean, look, it has its own funding stream. It's insulated from much of your oversight and has great latitude and discretion how it interprets its own rules of operation. It's essentially been created as an entity outside of the constitutional system. That strikes me as blatantly a violation of the basic rule of law itself. But the idea that you can't control it through any of your constitutional powers is highly unconstitutional and problematic. The solution, however, is you've got to get control of it through legislation. This thing has been created, and there are other examples, and I think this will become a pattern now, because you want to have things, if you want to do policy and you can't get it through Congress, you want to create ways to do it. This is precisely why you need to use your primary power over the purse to get control of those things from an operational point of view.
If I can just add, Congress does something similar through the tax system. That is, rather than providing money for it and appropriating it with oversight, they provide a tax break, which may be overseen by IRS, maybe it isn't, but it's largely uncontrollable.
And I won't have time for my third question, but Mr. Collender, I agree with you about political courage. And
thank you.
I think we need more of that on Capitol Hill. So thank you very much for your very candid answers, gentlemen. And I yield back the remainder of my time. Mr.
Gentlemen.
Price.
Gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Bryan, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for being late, but I'm coming from related matters. I was just over with Senator Mike Lee and Jeb Hensarling on the Article 1 project, very related, on the power of the purse. Today, the topic was the regulatory budget. And I think we have about $2 trillion in GDP impact there. So we discussed that. Mike Lee has a picture in his office of 4 inches of law passed by Congress in 2013 and 11 feet of law coming out of the executive branch, just as a nice illustration of the role of Congress in relation to the executive and judiciary, how we've been giving our power away. The question I'm going to come to you in a minute deals with the mandatory spending and the issue my colleague just brought up with where we're operating out of bounds of the Constitution. And all of this comes down to a matter of where the key word is courage and political will and all this kind of thing. And so if you can help us think through what are the main levers we can use to put pressure back on us, right, using the people. There's no alternative that I'm aware of, right? We have to bring political pressure to bear on ourselves. And the strongest arguments you can give us on the constitutionality, et cetera, or when you were discussing, you know, the budget resolution, some specifics of how you would use the budget resolution to put pressure on ourselves to reform the mandatory programs. And I'll just tee it up for 1 minute while you think of some comments there. We get Madison refer here, Congress is least popular. James Madison, when the public sees it is ineffectual, most visible demonstration was Congress fails at budgeting. In 10 years, all federal revenues go to mandatory spending, right? So that's about as ineffectual as you can be. In 10 years, that means there won't be any revenues left for the military, education, transportation, et cetera. We'll have to deficit finance the entire discretionary part of the budget. So we are at a fiscal collapse point in 10 years in terms of budgeting. And so we need to hear the pressure arguments from you. And then in the next paragraph, if a budget system is more centered on the executive, if the legislature controls more of the budget, well, Article 1 of the Constitution says we have all authority, right? All authority to make all law, all, A-L-L. And so if you can help me tee it up a little bit, just very briefly, any concrete paths we can go down to use constitutional authority, the budget resolution to get at this mandatory issue, Dr. Joyce?
So the first thing I would say is I could not agree more with probably you and Madison that the relatively low approval rating of the Congress has been earned by the failure of the Congress to take action. And so in that sense, the power that you have is the power to make laws. And I think you have abdicated to some extent the power that you have to make laws by continuing to not have budget resolutions, or in the budget resolution not trying to get control over those parts of the budget. So, what I would do, frankly, is to use the powers that you already have, as opposed to coming up with, sort of creative, triggers, sequesters, things like that, that have been shown not to work.
Right, great, thank you. Mr. Collender?
It's interesting, you said, how do we put political pressure on ourselves when the things that would put political pressure are the things that Congress most avoids, like a vote on the deficit in the budget resolution.
Right, and that's why I'm asking you.
But the point I wanted to make was that, 85-90% of incumbents get reelected anyway.
Yeah.
So there's no pressure on you, and it's not clear that the average American voter cares. I mean, they will care when there's a crisis.
Right, no,
but not before. Not before.
And I'm asking you, because that's the given. The evidence is in on the lack of performance.
Well, if you're not going to vote for the budget, the thing that's supposed to allow voters to judge your performance, then you're gaming the system. So let's call a spade here. That is, Congress's evasion of the budget rules are in large part re-election efforts. So
Yep, and therefore you got any? Give us the levers to use to move forward that we can use to message out to the American people. I can make that point. Okay, so that's good.
Okay, there are none.
Good. Dr. Spalding tried to cut you off with 16 seconds.
I would just make. I think we have to understand this whole thing in the context of the rise of a new imperial presidency and a vast weakness of Congress as an institution. Congress needs to strengthen itself and its processes, absolutely. But the Madisonian solution, go back to the election of 1800. The Madisonian solution is that when the departments are in conflict, you drive it towards election and you make a political argument to the American people. I don't think they've heard a serious argument about these questions because it is so hidden in the processes which hide the fundamental questions about the unsustainability. These kinds of arguments need to be made about process because that's the way that you're going to get at the political issues that the American people need to hear about.
Well said. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired, and I think that probably is a wonderful note upon which to end because it speaks to both parties. What all of you said, and I can't thank you enough for your testimony today, was that the legislative branch is weak and is not doing its job. the way to put things back on track is for the legislative branch to do its job. Our goal is to try to find the processes that will force us or incentivize us to a much greater degree to do that. So I want to thank each and every one of you for appearing before us today. Please be advised that members may submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will also be made a part of the formal hearing record. Any members who wish to submit questions or any extraneous material for the record may do so within 7 days. This committee stands adjourned.
Nice work. Nice work.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thanks very much.